Well, thank you so much for inviting me along to speak tonight. My name's Rachel Richards and I'm BLines officer for Buglife. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about BLines and pollinators and what you can do to support pollinators. So yeah, the basic structure, I'm going to talk about the importance of pollinators, the problems that they face, how BLines is a solution, and how we can all support BLines. So just to start off, I'm not going to read all of those numbers, but just so you see, there is an amazing diversity and abundance of invertebrate species in the UK, far more than many of us realise. So over 4,000 species of beetle. I mean, 37 wood lice. You wouldn't think there was that many. And then there's the marine invertebrates as well. So a huge diversity of invertebrates on our small isles. Oh, that went too fast. So the value of invertebrates, obviously they have their own intrinsic value and beauty as individual species, but they also provide really important ecosystem services. So they provide enhanced pollination services. So an assemblage of a diversity of different pollinators of different sizes means that a large number of different plants can be pollinated and successfully pollinated. Invertebrates can provide integrated pest management. So that's predatory insects controlling other populations of insects so that everything is in harmony. So when you have a crop, you have a monoculture, you can often get a species that may become a bit of a pest because there's lots of food for it. But where you have that semi-natural habitat alongside it, you can support those predatory insects that help to keep things in balance. Invertebrates are food for other wildlife, of course. They're the base of the food chain. So where the invertebrates are doing well, other things do well. They also help to improve the condition of soil, improve the nutrient cycling, the water efficiency, the aeration. So the soil is full of invertebrates as well, small and larger ones that help to keep it healthy. So the importance of pollination. So 8 out of 10 wild plants need insect pollination. And 1 in 3 mouthfuls of our food depends on pollinators. And 84% of EU crops rely on insect pollination. So obviously there's a huge financial element connected to that as well. So wild pollinators increase yield, they increase crop production stability, and also the quality of that yield and the flavour. When you've got that assemblage of wild invertebrates, plants are better pollinated. So the pollinator army, it's not just the bees, obviously not just the honeybees, also the wild bees, butterflies and moths all contribute, flies contribute, beetles. So not all of those insects might be as efficient pollinators, but with the abundance, with the number of visits, they are also contributing to pollination. Sorry, it keeps going too fast. So the pollination army involves in the UK at least 4,000 species. So just a few beautiful images there of some of our invertebrates. So bumblebees, just a little bit about a few of our pollinators. So we have 24 species of bumblebee. And bumblebees can visit twice as many flowers per minute as honeybees. So they're very good pollinators. Because they're big, they can do longer foraging trips. Bumblebees will often forage 1 kilometre or 2 from their nest, their central place foragers. And bumblebees and a lot of solitary bees also can carry out buzz pollination. So buzz pollination is a type of pollination where they detach the flight muscles, they vibrate their body, and they encourage the anther to release the pollen. And some plants need to be pollinated in that way, so they require that buzz pollination. They won't be pollinated by honeybees, for example. So things like tomatoes, kiwis, aubergine, broad beans, quite a few commercial crops require that buzz pollination. And just a few images there of some of our common bumblebees. Now, solitary bees, we have around 250 species of solitary bees. Some people will be surprised to know. Higher diversity in the south of England and slightly less as you get north, as you might expect with a colder climate. And they nest in cavities, either in the ground or in, so we divide them into ground nesters and aerial nesters generally. So some will dig little holes in the ground, different species preferring different substrates. Others will use holes in wood, often created by beetles and the like, or bee hotels, and even in the hollow ends of brambles and the like. So they'll nest in different substrate depending on the species. And such bees are quite messy in the way that they carry pollen. Most of them, there's one or two that carry it internally. Most of them carry them, as you can see in those images, on their pollen brushes, on the back legs or under the abdomen. So when they're moving around between plants, they do a lot of pollinating. Now, hoverflies, around 270 species of hoverfly in the UK. And they'll visit the same flowers in succession, so good for pollination in that respect. Many of them are generalists, so visiting a lot of different plants, and around 80% of garden flowers are visited by hoverflies. Now, when you're thinking about providing resources in your garden or wherever it may be for these insects, different bees and hoverflies like different shaped flowers with different depths of corolla. In general, hoverflies have got quite short mouth parts, so they like those shallow flowers. So they like things from the pea family, things that are very open, things like parsley and daisies and things that they can get into easily, whereas some of the bees will get into deeper flowers. So different bee species, again, will have different tongue lengths. Like a garden bee, for example, has got a very long tongue, long face, and they love things like foxglove, and they'll get into those deep flowers, whereas some other species have got shorter mouth parts and prefer shorter flowers. So having that range of different flowers and through the flowering season means you're providing food for different insects. And hoverflies also predate aphids. So, if you're a gardener and you're getting an aphid problem in the garden, or, you're getting too many on your roses, if you have that habitat that supports the adult hoverfly to feed, then the larvae, they lay their eggs near aphids, and their larvae that look like little flat caterpillars will feed on those aphids and help to keep those under control. So what's the problem that our invertebrates and other wildlife are facing? Well, nationally, there's been a 60% decline. The State of Nature report last year revealed in the species that were studied, and that was over 3,000 species. There'll be another State of Nature report coming out soon, I think tomorrow, in fact, but it's not a good picture. So this is just some sort of headlines, really, that more than 2/3 of pollinating insects in the UK are in decline. We've done something called the Bugs Matter survey, which I'll go into shortly, and that showed declines in abundance between 2004 and 2022 of 64%, which is high. And 6 bumblebee species have declined by at least 80% in the last 50 years. And again, declines with butterflies there of 76% decline in abundance or occurrence over the past 40 years. So there's some very bad news there. Obviously, that's not the case with all species. There are species that are doing well, and there are species that are moving north with climate change. But overall, the picture is decline, unfortunately. So this is Bugs Matter. Bugs Matter is something that everyone can contribute to during the summer months. It has ended now for this year. But it's looking at the windscreen phenomenon. So many of you will recall from when you were younger, driving around the countryside, and the windscreen is covered in splats. And you may have the same in humid areas, often, in Scotland and Wales, especially on a hot day, a hot, wet day. You get that splatter of insects. Well, we have historic data from 2004, and we are using that as part of a citizens science project alongside Kent Wildlife Trust that are supporting this, so that you can use a phone app. You clean your number plate, you take a photo. So you do the photo at the end, you clean your number plate, you start the app, you do a journey. At the end of the journey, you take another photo, record the number of splatted insects on your number plate. And that data is giving us an idea of how insect abundance is doing across the UK. So we can look at any trends in England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and compare with that data that we have from 2004. And the picture isn't exactly the same everywhere. The declines are worse in the drier areas, so in the southeast in particular, but there has been a big decline in abundance. But getting that data is something that we can then use to show the government and policymakers that this is serious and we need to change, and we need to take it seriously in terms of how we go forward. So again, a famous study you may well be aware of in 2017, a German study of some nature reserves, which showed a 75% decline in insect abundance over 25 years. So this is a nature reserve that should be managed well for wildlife, and there are still very big declines in abundance. So, you know, this is happening all over. And again, with butterflies and moths as well. So how did we get here? Why has this happened? So we have lost 97% of our species-rich wildflower meadows since the 1930s, largely through intensification of agriculture, also other development and other challenges for land use, but through an increase in pesticides and fertilizers, what we once considered improvements, and that increase in field size after the war, when we were taking out hedgerows, making fields bigger so that bigger machinery could be used, and that moved to more industrialized farming. Not the farmers' fault, it was what we told them to do, what they were told to do by the government, but it has resulted in the fragmentation of semi-natural habitat that's been left. So much of the remaining habitat, good habitat, is fragmented in the modern farm landscape. And there are areas that look like this, which is essentially a desert for invertebrates. There's been a low uptake in agri-environment schemes often of the beneficial wildflower options. And again, the payments for that needs to incentivize that take-up. So ultimately, we need more, bigger, better, and more connected areas for wildlife, as the Making Space for Nature report. Yeah, so the solution, let's move on to the positive. So we need to make landscapes work better for pollinators and other wildlife. We need more permanent connected wildflower-rich habitats. We want bigger areas, and we want the quality of those areas to be better. We want the mosaic approach, so you don't just get a wildflower meadow full stop, but you have other habitats within that as well. So you've got the hedgerows around the edge, you've got wet features, you've got areas of scrub within the landscape. And we want to increase the diversity of those habitat types. So what we're looking at is the permeability of the landscape. And by that, I mean the ability of the landscape to provide habitat so that invertebrates and other wildlife can move across the habitat. So when you think about things like solitary bees, some of these are tiny little species. They're only sort of 4 to 6 millimeters, some of the small solitary bees, and they don't travel a very long way. Again, they're central place foragers. They will have their hole or their nest, and they'll be traveling perhaps 200, 300, 400 meters from that nest. So if the landscape is very fragmented, and there is a lovely wildflower rich area, say a little nature reserve with a good population of a particular species, but something happens to that area, it's a very hot summer, all the plants are dried up by drought, there's very little for them to forage, they do really bad, and that population is lost on that site, it cannot recolonize from a neighboring site because there is no neighboring site, or the nearest site is, 5 miles away. So it's having that connectivity that allows the landscape to be permeable to invertebrates, so they can move around, so they can recolonize the site if they're lost from that site, or they can spread out in response to climate change, as many species are doing, moving north. And we want that connectivity both in rural and urban landscapes. So BLines, you can see there on the map, on the right, a map, or might be on your left, a map of the UK. If you go onto our website, Buglife, and look up under our work, you will find BLines, and you'll find this map. There's an interactive map. You can zoom in and look at where you live and see where this BLine is. So BLines is a network of 3-kilometre wide corridors, which are connecting up the best remaining areas of wildflower-rich habitat in the UK. So it's a shared map. We have created it with a lot of other organisations and individuals, but it's aimed at focusing the creation of flower-rich habitats in the UK in those BLines to address the decline in pollinators. So the exercise was guided by local expertise and knowledge, and it's something that many people and organisations have contributed to, from NGOs, local authorities, businesses, landowners, farmers, many people. So the guiding principles of BLines is, excuse me, within each county, there is a roughly east-west and a roughly north-south corridor. We want to create a continuous network of habitats that are linked up through the country. And within that BLines, so that 3-kilometre wide corridor, it would be amazing if that could be solid habitat, but obviously that is not practical. You know, people live there, there are farms, there are businesses, there are roads, there are other things going on in the landscape. But that 3-kilometre wide corridor, within that, what we are aiming for is stepping stones of flower-rich habitat, so that 10% of that BLines is filled, and that those BLines encompass the majority of the good flower-rich habitats that we have within the UK at the moment. It won't contain everything, but that route is picked to incorporate as many of the good sites as we can. So we want to link the biggest, largest sites where possible, where those are over 2 hectares in size. That's a size that can sustain obviously more species and larger populations, so be more robust. And whatever is good for pollinators is good for everything else. So if you're getting, so BLines actually stands for biodiversity lines, and the B element of it is often the draw, because they have that interest, you know, the flagship sort of species group, as it were. But whatever is good for pollinators and invertebrates is good for the birds, the mammals, the reptiles, the amphibians, everything else that is above those in the food chain. So the process of developing BLines. So we started with a data collection exercise. So looking at all the designated sites of the different levels, from local wildlife sites and SSSIs to national parks, but also sites that aren't designated but are known to be rich in wildlife and semi-natural habitats. So often river corridors and coastal edges and the like, those areas that haven't been developed, often because it's not practical. We assessed the value of those habitats in terms of their flower richness. We then identified potential networking using linkage mappers. So we worked with Liverpool University and various different models to look at the best way of connecting up those areas. And then we had stakeholder workshops in each county. Where possible, they were round the table events. And there was a consultation involved there. So I think the next slide shows that better. So that's a round the table event with a map with all the designated sites marked on, and then with the people in the room, they're all local people working in NGOs, local authority, farms, individuals, naturalists, people, you know, like many of yourselves on the call that know your local area. And what lives and grows, and you know what habitats you have there, and what species of importance you're trying to support in your area, to then try and decide where should this north-south go, where should the east-west go, to incorporate as much of that habitat as possible. Now in September 2023, there's around 3,000 dots on the map. And over 3,500 hectares of wildflower work that's been added on there. I'll just go back to that one a minute. So I'll go into it a little bit later, but on that map on the website, you can zoom in and see where other people have added their work. And I'll go into that a little bit later in terms of what we're adding on and how and where. So this is the active BLines projects at the moment. So everybody is adding to the map. But Buglife are continually running new projects in different parts of the country. So these are all our active projects at the moment. You can see a couple there in Scotland, one in Northern Ireland. The Neathport Talbot BLines project has just come to an end. There's North Cornwall, Spaces for Nature in Surrey, Changing Chalk down in Sussex, Get London Buzzing. So the last BLine that we just completed at the beginning of this year was the east-west line through London. So we've finally completed all of that mapping across the UK. But if you are near any of those areas and you want to get involved, do have a look on our website. There's lots of things on the What's On section, but we're always very keen to get lots of people involved, local people involved with getting into the project. We also have a number of vacancies available at the moment as well, so do have a look if you're interested. So how we can all support BLines. So the first thing, I'll go through each one of these in a minute, but looking after and valuing what we have, then improving what we have, and then increasing the connectivity across the landscape and spreading the word of BLines so others can do the same. So looking after what we have. So there's the protected sites, of course, and I'm sure all of us have something near us, I would hope, be it a local wildlife site or a SSI or something bigger. So do get involved with volunteering on those sites if you can. So many of those sites are managed through the work of volunteers. I'm sure many of you already do that. But some of the basic principles that we would talk about in terms of managing green spaces are avoiding wherever possible that use of chemicals. Herbicides don't just affect plants, you know, they do have an impact on invertebrates as well, and potentially on the people that use them as well. So avoid that chemical usage wherever possible. Also in your gardens, just something to be aware of when you're buying plants and things, you know, you're buying in compost free. I think most people are aware of that now, but also where possible buy organic, because plants are often treated with chemicals. The ones that you're buying in garden centres are often treated, so you're bringing those chemicals into the ecosystem of your garden or your green space that you're managing. Encourage those wild plants. I don't like the word weed that people so often use. I mean, dandelions are just amazing for insects, so many. You know, pollen beetles, hoverflies, bees, so many things in the spring really depend on them. So you might not want them taking over your lawn. That's up to each person, isn't it, of course, but, you know, leave some along the edges. And start maybe noticing what's on them or recording what's on them, taking photos, see if you can identify them, because so many insects use them. And then of course they make good honey as well. If you've got too many, you can make honey, you can make coffee with the roots. They're brilliant plants. So yeah, encourage those wild plants, and have a diverse range of flowering plants all through the year. So you've got things from the spring and through to the autumn. So this is talking more about managed green spaces. In those like garden spaces, in the nature reserves, it's just getting involved with supporting the management of those, you know, flower rich open areas. So it's things like scrub control, supporting with that. Within any space, obviously we talk a lot about the flower resources, but bees and other pollinators need nesting habitat. So a lot of hoverflies use ponds or other little wet habitats, things like rot holes that you get in trees, which you can recreate by making little hoverfly lagoons. Many invertebrates need dead wood, so there's different dead wood habitats, different types of wood supporting different invertebrates. Wood in the sun, supporting different invertebrates to wood in the shade. So those log piles are fantastic habitats. If they've got beetle holes, they can be used for nesting, or you can stick a few holes in and see what uses them. But also bare grounds. Areas of bare ground are used by a lot of solitary bees, wasps and beetles. So why not have a look at the idea of creating a beetle bank, or a bee nesting bank, or just encouraging the areas that you've got in your garden by keeping them free. So having those little bits of bare ground is very important habitat as well. Ponds are a fantastic habitat for so much wildlife. So that, you know, they add value to any space really. And longer lawns, you know, just allowing, even if it's just part of your garden, to grow longer and to flower, and it'll stay green for longer, especially in the hot summer as well, which is nice. But as well as the insects that are using the flower, you'll get things like grasshoppers and leaf hoppers and things like that in your garden as well, which is lovely. And many of the butterflies need grasses. So it's not just the flowers. You know, if you want meadow brown and ringlet in your garden, you need some long grasses for their larvae to feed on. So whatever you can do, whether you've got a big green space or whether you've got a couple of pots on your balcony, every little bit helps. You know, a couple of flowering plants can be a refueling station for bees. So bees do try and optimize their foraging, as any sensible creature would. So if you have a particular flower, for example, you have some hellebores in the springtime, rather than having one at one side of the garden, the other one at the far side of the garden, to make it better for the bees, you might have a little patch and they can forage more efficiently in that patch without having to waste energy traveling. So it's another thing to think about, those plants through the season, but also where are you putting them? If something's popular, can you spread it and have a bigger patch of that plant as well? So observe what's happening in your garden, observe in the area where you live and see what they're using, and, you know, maybe get cuttings of other people if those plants are popular in your area. So what about improving what we have? So enhancing, restoring and creating wildflower-rich habitats. So I talk a lot about managing grassy areas. So with councils, local authorities, housing associations, we have a lot of green verges in our green England, but we have this habit, obviously, of cutting them. Well, not obviously, but yeah, we all see it, don't we? We have this habit of cutting, gang mowing, maybe every couple of weeks, dumping the cuttings, and surprise, surprise, we don't see an awful lot flowering. Maybe a bit of white clover, a few dandelions, which are great, but not much else gets a chance to flower. So what we want to try and do as much as possible is reduce those cuttings so things can grow longer, things can start to flower a bit more, but also it's cut and collect. So it's taking those cuttings away. When you leave the cuttings, they rot down, they put the nutrients back into the soil, which might sound like a good thing, but actually wildflowers do better in lower nutrient soils. One of the reasons is because they're not outcompeted by lush grass. So when there's a lot of nutrients, the grass does really well, gets really big, smothers everything else. So we need to be moving wherever possible to sort of replicating the hay cut. So you do a cut and collect in the spring, another cut and collect at the end of the summer. And you're gradually reducing the nutrients, you're gradually knocking back the grass, and you're making space for any wildflowers that are there to flower, to flourish, sorry, to seed as well. You know, dandelion seeds, goldfinches love it. And insects use the seeds as well. And you might want to vary the cutting times and frequency depending on the site. So a very high nutrient site, you might have to do 3 or 4 cuts to sort of lower that nutrient level. But also where you're managing a large area, you know, where councils are managing a lot of road verges, you know, imagine April, May, it's all yellow with dandelions and it's all cut at the same time. You know, those poor insects that were feeding on all of that, they've now come out of their hole in the morning. It's like, you know, where's all the food gone? It's gone from feast to famine. So where possible, you would cut maybe one side of the road 1 week, and then when that side's come back the next week, cut the other side of the road. So there's still those resources available. And the same thing in our garden, you know, if you're cutting an area, leave a strip and maybe cut that area a week or 2 later when the other bit's grown back. So there's always flowers available. Again, avoid the chemicals wherever possible. Avoid those chemicals. There are other ways, just trimming things back in your garden. If you've got things growing out of cracks and you like things very neat and tidy, boiling water can do the job. So yeah, there's other things you can do, and think about other features as well as the flowers. So wet features, hedges, bare ground, deadwood, the things we've mentioned before as well. So with invertebrates, you're thinking about heterogeneity in habitats. You're thinking about little microclimates. You know, they're looking for shelter from the wind. They're looking for those little sheltered corners that are a little bit warmer. They need to warm their body up in order to get going. A bumblebee on a morning, you know, they need that heat to get going. So they're looking for little niches, little microclimates within that habitat management. So we do a lot of work with farmers as well, and we're involved with the development of agri-environment schemes to make sure that invertebrates have a voice there as well. So again, it's the flower-rich habitats, it's avoiding the chemicals, it's those lovely species-rich hedgerows with trees as well. So hedgerows are very important in the flower sequence. Through the spring, you've got your blackthorn and your hawthorn, you've got things like crabapple. Later in the year, you've got brambles and roses and ivy. You know, there's a lot of resources there in the spring. Willow, which is very important. And it's having those wildflower-rich areas and having them across the farm, you know, not just little pockets here and there, but that connectivity across the farm. So yeah, creating species-rich grasslands as well. So there's times when it can be restored through changing management. There's other times when you can change that management and there's still not a lot of diversity coming through there. So natural regeneration is the first step. changing that management and seeing what flourishes as a result. The next thing that we would recommend, if that's not working, is the use of either green hay or brush harvested seed. So green hay is when you take hay from a flower-rich site nearby. It needs to be nearby because it's moved straight to the site before it drops its seed. So it then drops its seed on your donor site. And this is a colleague of mine in Cornwall, I believe, and they've scarified this field. She's actually hand spreading seed, but you can use green hay or brush harvested seed, which is where you're harvesting local seed from a local field. And the benefits of that is that you're bringing in plants that are growing in your area, on your soil, adapted to your climate, adapted to the disease and pest in your area. So you're maintaining that local genetic diversity. So that is the ideal. It's not always possible. And where not, you would purchase seed which is as local as possible. And again, try and match the species composition of the meadow that you're creating to the wildflower rich areas that you see naturally in your area. So you're creating something which is as natural as possible, which is what your local pollinators will be used to visiting and the plants that they need. You can also use plug plants. Again, locally sourced plug plants are brilliant. And then there's yellow rattle. So yellow rattle is a hemiparasitic plant. It's a lovely little yellow flower, as the name suggests, and it feeds off grasses. So it gets some of its nutrients from grasses. So the benefit of that is where you've got very thick grasses, not a lot of wildflowers there, the yellow rattle can help to knock back the vigor of the grasses, making more space for wildflowers. Plus, it is visited itself by pollinators as well. So it's a good food source for invertebrates. And then obviously you need to look at how those areas are managed and manage those well. So you're cutting at the right time, grazing at the right time, but they do require that management, which is basically mimicking the natural herbivory that would have once been there by roaming herbivores, which are moved around by predators. So we are maintaining that open grassy habitat artificially now because we don't have that natural ecosystem of wolves and roving herbivores and things sort of keeping areas open. And you may have to adapt the management depending on what you have on your site, whether you have late flowering species or species that are flowering in the middle of the year. You might vary that cutting or grazing time to favour those plants. So we also do a lot of work with local authorities and highways agency and rail organisations to look at how those green spaces around infrastructure are managed. And Cumbre Wildlife Trust have recently been doing Get Cumbre buzzing. They've done an awful lot of work along the trunk roads and other roads there. So improving that management, like we've been discussing, of wildflower areas and where needed, bringing in local seed to diversify the sward as well. So it's a lovely roadside verge there. And we also, within our BLines project, we do a lot of work in urban green spaces, getting the community involved. So whenever you can get the local people involved, obviously they take more ownership and have more understanding of what's going on, and you get that buy-in and that local support and that longevity of sites going forward. Done a lot of work with schools as well, and other organisations. So you can see green roofs there. They work very well in urban areas, green bus shelters, green roofs. And these are typically planted with 40+ wildflower species. So a fantastic resource for invertebrates. And there's a couple of companies that specialise in doing that. But, they're great projects to do with schools. There's a lot of curriculum learning that can go alongside that, the life cycle of the invertebrates, the growing of the plants. And so, a great sort of project to do with schools as well. And any work that you do like this can go on BLines. So we're really interested in the meadow work, the hectares, but also little community projects in community gardens, in schools, in your own garden. All of that can go on to the BLines. So in terms of adding your work to BLines, this is the map on the website, just a little screenshot there. So you can zoom into that, you can find where you live. These blue circles, as you zoom in, they'll turn into little blue dots that you can click on, and you can find out what other people are doing in your local area. So anybody can add to there. There's There's a lot of work on there from various organisations, but also lots of individuals just putting on what they've done in their garden or what they've done in their local school or community group. So you just use the add site button there in green, and you can click on, you can add your field or your garden, or anything that you would like to put on there, work that you're doing to improve a site for pollinators. So whether it's putting in a little pollinator garden, or whether you have a mini meadow, or whether you put in a wildlife friendly pool, pond, you can add all of that onto the BLines. And it helps to motivate other people in your area as well when they go on to see what's already happening in the area. So how can you support BLines? So spread the word in your communities. Like I've said, add your work to the BLines map, so gardens, community spaces, etc. Do talk to your council about how they manage the green spaces, road verges and the like, and get involved with trying to improve that management. Putting up little signs explaining to people what's going on. If it looks a bit scruffy, this is why, it's not neglected. We're allowing things to flower, allowing those grasses to grow. Within local nature reserves and wildlife sites, if you can, do contribute with be it practical volunteering if you have the time, or whether it's recording as well and sending those records in. So I'm sure many people on this call are specialists in different groups and do a lot of recording, so do send in those records to the Records Centre. And that's all very valuable information that gives the conservation managers more knowledge of the species they have on their sites, and then they can look at the management requirements for those species. And do use BLines as a funding lever as well. If you're applying for funding for a project and you're on BLines, do include that in the funding application, and that you are contributing to this national network of connected pollinator friendly sites. And yeah, share that species information that you have to site managers. Don't assume that a site manager knows all the things that you have seen on their sites. They may well be, experts in something different in a different group or in managing the sites, but they might not know about the mollusks, or they might not know about the birds, or about the butterflies. So do share your knowledge to contribute to that work. So I think that's me. I seem to have rattled through a lot, but no doubt there'll be a few questions. Thank you.